I'm delighted that you are with us today. Welcome from IMD for the book club. And my name is Heather Cairns-Lee. I'm a professor of leadership and communication here. And I'm a member of our Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Council and have been a strong advocate for gender diversity, having been president of Business Professional Women Lake Geneva. So I love this space. I'm delighted to be here today with our guest, the author of the book, Everyone Included, Belonging, Diversity and Inclusion in Your Team. So Helen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Heather. Looking forward to it.
Great. As we start off, Helen, you have quite a rich background in the corporate space, in the consulting space. Would you perhaps say a couple of words about yourself personally and professionally so that everyone knows who we're talking with?
Yes, of course. So I started life after university thinking that I was going to go into politics after doing a French and politics degree, but realised that I was probably too outspoken to be an apprentice in that area. So went into the corporate world. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry where I carried the bag for a couple of years and went pretty quickly into head office to start doing some training, learning and development. And that's where my went from there. So I headed up talent and culture in pharmaceuticals and publishing before going off and setting up my own business and consultancy. So my business is Belonging at Work. We work with a lot of the big corporates. We work with a lot of the big banks. We have a huge range. I think that the beauty of what I do is that we have such a huge range of clients because there are different challenges in different industries, and we get quite a lot of ex-military. Where there's a lot of ex-military personnel and things like that in because they have different challenges. So I have some wonderful clients. I also have another business, which is where I support people with ADHD, autism, and other neurodevelopmental disorders. I work with neuropsychiatrists. I also do research. So I research around identity and ADHD, particularly in women. And I love what I do. It doesn't feel like work, which is the best thing. It's like being opinionated for a living, which I think I was born to do. So I live in Oxford. I'm originally from Liverpool, so I have to be really careful to slow down my talking.
Right, that's an important element for us today, is to make sure two native English women speaking about belonging and with a very multicultural, multinational set of people from around the world delighted, and we'll make sure we manage that aspect of ourselves. Thank you so much for that introduction. Now, of course, belonging is a really important aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there are many terms that are used today around in this space. And perhaps it's helpful for us to think a little bit about what some of that terminology is and differentiate a little bit so that we lay the foundations, if you like, of what we're talking about. And just as we do that, before we do that, what I'd like to ask you, if you're joining us on the webinar, is if you have comments, if you have questions, please pop them in the chat. I will monitor the chat and I will do my best to bring your questions in. And potentially we would like to have some time towards the end of our conversation to be able to really pick up on any comments and any questions. So if we speak for the first 40 minutes or so, and then we have some time for questions, that would be fantastic. So knowing that webinars are less interactive than perhaps other forms of communication, we'd nevertheless like to invite you to share your perspective with us. So having said that, diversity often described as how, the differences that we all have. Diversity is a fact that the world is quite made up of very many different people. Inclusion is a choice, isn't it, to whether we include people or not. And then there's belonging, and you focus very much on this issue of belonging. Can you share a bit about what's important about belonging and how do you think about it?
So I believe that one of the things that one of the reasons we haven't made as much progress in diversity and inclusion is firstly, it's become very processed, it's very jargon, it's full of jargon and terminology, and it doesn't really consider the human experience of being in the workplace. So I think that when we talk about inclusion is essentially our need to belong in any one situation. It's a primal need. You know, primitive man had to belong to a tribe in order to be able to eat, drink, procreate, have warmth, and they had to bring some value to it. And if they were rejected, they weren't safe. Now, our primitive brain is still there, and our need to belong is a fundamental need. If we feel that we don't belong, we don't feel safe. So when we talk about psychological safety, that's what we're talking about. It's a human experience. It's a psychological experience, and it's such a primitive need that it kicks in our subconscious in any situation. Do I belong here? Am I safe here? And babies who don't get that sort of interaction from adults and warmth and love, even if they get everything else, they don't thrive. Their immune system suffers. They will be very restless. That doesn't go away. If people are not included in the workplace, if they don't feel that they belong, it affects both their mental and their physical health, and therefore their performance.
Okay, so linking it back to our evolution, really, in terms of how we have grown up as individuals, as humans, in communities and societies, it's a very primal need. Very much. If we think of Maslow, we were talking about this the other day. If we think about Maslow, it's very fundamental. It's one of the fundamental needs that we actually have. And I think when we talk about belonging, we can't talk about belonging without talking about belonging to something. We can, of course, belong to ourselves and with ourselves, and that's an important element, I think, of any human endeavor, that we have a sense of belonging and being at home with ourselves. And I think we can come back to this idea when we come to thinking about belonging in organizations. But you have an interesting take, I think, in terms of belonging and community. So perhaps we can think a bit about community, and what are your thoughts around community and its relationship with belonging?
So I think that community is something that has, again, it's evolved because we're human beings, and it's safer and it's better for us to exist in communities. And in communities, people have shared goals. They're not all the same, but they will have one shared goal or interest. But also they will have an interest in protecting everybody within that community. The workplace is a fake social structure. It's an organization. That's how we talk about it. And we have processes, and we have standards, and we have frameworks, and all these things. And that sometimes takes that human need. It doesn't help that human need to belong, but it does in a community. So if we reimagine the organization as a community, I think it's easier to get that shared sense of purpose and protect well-being by creating a sense of belonging for everybody.
Okay, so you're talking about how you see a bit of a difference between community and organizations. Are there some specific elements that you would differentiate between an organization and a community? Because I think we could see perhaps communities at work. There can be sub-communities in an organization, but are there some big differences that you see between community and organization that it's helpful for us who are looking to create senses of belonging in our lives?
Yeah, I think that in the organization, it first of all, even though it has evolved, that there is definite hierarchy. And I think sometimes that hierarchy gets in the way of understanding the lived experience and giving a voice to everybody, which in a community people do. In your local community, you will have a voice about what happens within that community. And I think that while we try to do this within the organization, there are some things that get in the way. Another example is when is things like behavior frameworks. We have way we tell people, this is a behavior framework, this is how you should behave.
Sometimes called competency frameworks, would you say? Yeah, so many organizations use competencies. These are the competencies by which we would measure people and we would expect people to live within our organization. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And very often they are in parallel with values.
Right.
What happens in a community is that a standard, a charter, naturally emerges that is in the interest and agreed with by everybody within that community. So we know how we have to behave in our local area. We know what will help our neighbours, for example. We don't have to be told that if you are here, this is how you have to do everything. So in a community, I think that allows people to be more authentically present, and it allows them to contribute in a way that looks after their own needs as well as those of others.
Okay, and so one of the differences I'm hearing you make between organization and community is that organizations, perhaps they develop these processes to bring people together, to set behaviors, to set values, to set standards to which people then need to adhere. Whereas in communities, it's more of a bottom-up process that people perhaps have more of a voice in creating that. And of course, must be a continuum, that it's not black and white, because in some communities, of course, we struggle to find our voices as well. I think that's part of a human process. But this idea that in organizations, perhaps it's more imposed, and in communities, there's more of a bottom-up process.
That's right. With one of my clients, it's an architecture practice. What we've done is to set up a community hub. So this is to separate the HR from the community. Very often HR, human resources, have such a difficult task because they have to protect the organisation as well as the individuals within it. And that's that there's a tension between those two things sometimes. So if the community hub is there really to represent the voices of the people without the need to protect the organisation. And this is something I've been talking recently to a lot of private equity firms about, which is, investors more and more are wanting to know who is representing the voice of the people.
Yeah.
Because there is much more responsibility, it's understood responsibility these days to make sure that people are protected. And some investors recognise that it's not always, you don't always get that from the human experience from HR.
Right. Okay. And another element, coming back to your thinking around identity, I think one way of thinking about community and organizations is we voluntarily join communities that reflect perhaps our identity. And therefore, perhaps we have this embedded, felt sense of lived experience of belonging. And in organizations, perhaps there are ways in which because there's some standards, some norms, there's a sense in which perhaps parts of our identity may not feel as welcome. And I think that's part of what you're talking about with this book, isn't it? How we engender this sense of belonging and by being able to bring more of our full self to work.
Absolutely. So psychologically, we all need two things. One is agency and one is communion. Right. Agency is it's how we interact with our environment, how we exert our influence, how we share our opinions, and how we create value, use our talents. Communion is how we then connect to other people around us. And it's really important that we're able to do both of these things in an authentic way, with a core, strong identity that goes with us throughout our life and our career. When that's challenged and there is starting to be a difference in how you behave at work and how you behave somewhere else, it's not good for mental health to do that, and it's not good for performance. Brené Brown talked about in her research that she did, the opposite of belonging is fitting in.
The idea of conforming to a norm. So only certain parts of me are welcome, and therefore I leave the parts of me that are not so welcome out of the door. I think this gets to the nub of what the term intersectionality, which is often used in the vernacular of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's how we have not just one fixed identity, but multiple aspects of our identity. So we can say we're, what gender we are, what race we are, what ethnicity are, what sexual orientation we have, and then whether we have perhaps things that are less visible under the diversity iceberg. Do we have mental health issues that we may mask going into an organization? Are we a member of a religious faith that feels that it has much less of a home in an organization? So these intersecting aspects of our identity perhaps find very nice homes in the communities outside of work, but it's what you're talking about is how can we bring all of those parts of ourselves to work. And I think there's a lovely film that you've created, and maybe this is a good moment to share that film, Helen. So what I'm going to do is suggest that we share a film. It's 75 seconds, so it's not very long. It gives you some ideas of what is community. And then we've got a poll for you to think about. Which communities do you find more or less challenging to think about, to work with, to embrace? Because we all have our preferences, we all have our biases. That's part of the human condition as well. And so perhaps it's helpful to look at the film, enjoy the film. It's short but sweet, and use it as a way to think, get your brain to think about which of the communities do you find it most or easiest to interact with. Let me see.
Stay now, stay now, stay now, stay, stay now, stay now, stay now, stay.
Lovely film. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much for sharing it with us, Helen. And I leave the question on the screen just for a moment for you to think about. Which communities do you belong to? And of course, we have a short period of time together today, but it's a great question for you to think about and maybe doodle and draw all the multiple communities you belong to and which part of your identity they actually represent. And if I'm also going to then share the poll, so let me go to that just to get you to think a bit about what we're inviting you to do with the poll is to click on the identities that you are most comfortable interacting with. So we've got 8 different aspects of identity: non-binary, devout religious faith, anxiety, tattoos, neurodiversity, schizophrenia, ex-offenders, or physical disability. So this is clearly not an exhaustive list, but it's a list of an aid memoir, a prompt for you to think about which of the identities are you most comfortable interacting with, and therefore, which ones are you least comfortable? Well, just give a minute or so for you to think about that and respond to the poll. And maybe as I love the technology, how we're connected over 100 people from all over the world, and we have this shared visual of how we're gathering our experience together. And as we're doing this, I'm going to invite Helen to perhaps comment on what you're seeing here based on your experience. Is there anything surprising there? Perhaps less surprising?
I like what's coming up in the chat here, actually, Heather, because
okay, I can't see the chat, so you'll have to monitor the chat whilst I've got this on my screen. Super.
I'm glad that you're all saying that it was difficult and it was an odd list, and I'm glad that you found it difficult to answer or talk. Somebody said they connect well with most things. It's deliberately difficult. It's deliberately meant to make you think who might be excluded in a community. It's meant to make you think, what experience do I have of these different things? And do I genuinely interact with them all in the same way? Because when we don't have lived experience of something ourselves, it creates fear sometimes. We make assumptions. We don't want to get things wrong. So we back off. And very often these things are not just the things that we're born with, the differences that we're born with. They're things that you might not see, as Heather said, but they're also things that people acquire through their life that becomes a part of who they are. It becomes a part of their identity. People will have experiences, good and bad. When we become a parent, our identity shifts. So this is why belonging is different to the way we've looked at diversity and inclusion, because it's saying, let's look at and understand the lived experience of everybody here. Focus on the identity and what that person needs to thrive, what they need to perform, what they need help with, and what is the role of the leader in doing that? What should a leader do to be able to make sure that they are genuinely, looking at individuals and not making assumptions. Our brains have a very strange thing called mirror neurons in them. And mirror neurons are when we observe somebody doing something, a behavior, it goes to the part of our brain that asks, if I was doing that, why would I be doing it? And then from that, we make an assumption about why somebody is behaving in a certain way. So it's always based on our lived experience. So when we make assumptions, we should be thinking, what can I do to understand what it's like experiencing the world as this person? One of the things is that when you look at leadership, when you look at engagement surveys, you very often find that senior leaders in organizations will say that it's a very inclusive organization. Everybody has a good sense of belonging. But that goes down, the lower down the ranks that you go, it decreases. So this understanding of the lived experience of people around them in leadership is generally quite low. Mm-hmm. So it begs the question, should we rethink leadership? And I think that the results actually of this poll demonstrate this beautifully, because nobody has said that they are most comfortable interacting with ex-offenders. And it's one of those things that morally, from a distance, we will say ex-offenders, ex-criminals should be given the chance to work, to change their ways, and to live a normal life. We say that from a distance. When we're close to it, it's a bit scary, because we've not experienced it. I do quite a lot of work talking about prisoners and this sense of belonging. Very often they will have things such as 40% of people, repeat offenders in prisons, have ADHD. And because they've always felt different, they have a really low sense of belonging. So one of the things that I talk about with prisons and things is about how do you get them to have that sense of agency and communion so that they can go out there and belong? But it also means that we have to become more interested and more curious about how people experience the world.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Helen, because of course the list is deliberately provocative, and most of us, as Annette, hello Annette, and I agree. I'm not sure that I know any ex-offenders. Maybe we do, but we're not aware of it. So the list, you might say, gosh, this is a little bit outside the norm of an organisation, and deliberately a bit provocative to get us to think on the edges of who we include and who we don't include. But if we think about creating a culture of belonging in the workplace, what characterizes that, Helen? What are the characteristics of that? Because I think it's useful to talk about that. And then you also talk in your book about 5 principles of belonging. I think it'd be really helpful if we can talk about those principles and the characteristics of a belonging organization.
So I think, as we've talked so far, at the heart of the what's different in a belonging organization, at the heart is the sense of community. It's the sense that there is that people are there, that they are protected by the organization, that the organization is there to help people to thrive, flourish, excel, and develop and grow. So that's the central part of it. And then essentially you've got 4 different things then that will support the development of the right sort of culture.
Right.
Culture is simply, it's a sum of all the things that happen and the behaviors of the people within an organization. What I see in organizations a lot is diversity and inclusion being led by process and targets and numbers, and not by behaviors. So it's flipping on its head. Get the behaviors right before you increase the diversity and the processes.
So taking less of a processual perspective and focusing on the lived experience of the people that make up the organization, its culture, is yes. What you're proposing.
There was one very unfortunate case that went to court in an organization in the UK where they wanted to increase the amount of autistic people working in the business. Mm-hmm. So they did a recruitment drive deliberately around neurodiversity. What they hadn't done was prepare the environment, prepare the leaders, prepare the processes, the reasonable adjustments. And this guy came in, and within 6 months, he was suicidal. That's how bad his experience was, because of the way his leader was treating him. Now, that wasn't the leader's fault. That was the organization's fault. You know, it was like putting him into the lion's den. The organization had a duty to prepare the environment for people's differences. So that's a very extreme example, I think. But one of the things so the aspect of culture, I think, is firstly, we start with the behaviors. And there's 3 different types of behaviors. There's the individual, there's the team, and there is the leadership. And I think that we have to, one of the things that we should start with, and I was just doing this morning with a team in Cambodia, actually, is helping people to understand who they are, what is their identity, and them having a real core sense of self. If we can do that when people start workplace, graduates, we would make a huge difference to the mental health burden. I genuinely believe it.
Yeah, I think that this correlates very strongly with research that we did at IMD last year on inclusive futures and inclusive leadership, which is this sense of, can I be who I am? Can I understand my uniqueness? Can I get a sense of self-awareness? And then can I bring that to work? And I saw a lovely comment on the chat a little bit earlier that we don't necessarily want to bring our full perimenopausal sense to work. Yes, of course, we need self-regulation. We need to be able to manage ourselves and manage our emotions and whatever. But it's more a sense of can I bring more of, can I know who I am, and can I bring more of that to work? Because if we don't do that, we end up masking, and the cost of masking is enormous, isn't it? Whether it be from gender identities, whether it be from sexual orientation, whether it be from neurodiverse perspectives. I mean, the ways in which the lost time, energy, and if you put it in organizational terms, productivity that is lost to masking is enormous, isn't it, Helen?
Hugely. And, you know, this is not a nice to have. This is fluffy. This is not, oh, here we go, another exercise that we're doing, the flavor of the month. We're talking about human beings.
Mhm.
When human beings don't belong, when human beings don't feel that they are accepted, when they don't feel that they are consistent in their identity in all contexts, pathways in the brain break down, and that can be for good.
Mhm.
The other thing is that a part of the brain called the hippocampus can shrink. When the hippocampus shrinks, physical health declines. So we're not talking about somebody just developing a bit of resilience, or telling people that you shouldn't feel like that because denying how their experience is. It's not something that can just be changed. We are talking about physical and
Neural pathways.
neural pathways. The brain changes shape if you have low self-esteem.
Yes, and this is, I mean, there's been a lot of research that shows that changing the way we think actually changes the brain. And so if we're in environments that enable us to think differently about ourselves, perhaps with more self-esteem, more of a sense of acceptance and belonging, then that's good for our brain health as well as good for us as human beings.
But also for performance, because when one of it's the reward pathway that breaks down with low self-esteem, and that pathway talks to the front bit of our brain. And that front bit of the brain is the bit that organizes things, plans things, remembers things. It's the adult in us. It's the one that is able to remember things, get things right, make decisions, take healthy risks. And in some people, it's impaired anyway. But people with low self-esteem, people who only get negative feedback, don't have positive reinforcement of the value that they as a person create, they can't, it doesn't work very well. So performance, somebody who doesn't belong, their performance drops, not because of engagement or one of these words that we use. It drops because their brain can't work properly anymore. Can't help it.
I mean, it's a wonderfully impassioned way of saying it, not in terms of competency frameworks, etc., but also around, what it does to us as human beings. So I saw a comment just now about, is there a place for competence of belonging? The competence of belonging, just trying to manage the chat. Is there a role for competence in belonging in the organization? So Knut is asking us that. And I think absolutely yes. And that's one of the things that this book is really bringing to our attention, is that we do need to develop a competence in belonging. And in some ways, we might feel it's our human birthright, but actually we're dependent on each other to make that work. So if we go back, you said there were some human elements that we can, some individual characteristics that we need to be focusing on. Can you tell us what those are, Helen?
Yeah, so I think that when we're doing identity work in organizations, what we want to be doing is getting people to use three core human behaviors.
Right.
The first one is about agency, like I've said, get people to understand who they are and how who they are creates value, and how they can interact with their environment in a way that doesn't threaten their identity. The big one for me, and it's something that I do a lot of research into, is curiosity. Curiosity is absolutely key to inclusion. I think if there's one thing that makes a difference, it's curiosity. And what we have to get rid of is judgment. So if it's a scale, if you're very curious about people and everything in your environment, then you will be more likely to understand other people's lived experience as well as your own. The opposite of that is to just judge, rely on, your biases, rely on your quick decisions, and think that everybody experiences the environment in the same way, which we don't. We'll experience it uniquely.
And I think, sorry, let me just add one thing, because I think it's super what you're talking about with the curiosity and the judgment. And of course, in some ways, those of us who are working in organizations, we're paid to use our judgment. We're paid to make decisions, which relies on our judgment. And so in some ways, it becomes a default mechanism that we don't notice. And when there was a comment earlier about bias, and of course, it's part of what feeds into our biases. And so actually, there's a lot of work to do to to just start noticing, oh, there I go again. I'm being judgmental about that, rather than, what if I were to be curious about this person or this experience or how I'm reacting to a particular situation? So realizing that it sounds very straightforward what you're saying, to be curious, not judgmental. I think the reality is actually quite difficult because of the way we're wired in our brains and the way we're rewarded in organizations is to really use that judgment to make decisions.
Yeah, and our organization will never ever do unconscious bias training. We don't do it. It's when we pitch for a business, when we do strategy, we say the one thing we will not do is talk about unconscious bias. So what we do for organizations when we're starting off on this journey with them, we do curiosity and judgment webinars. So they are these very short little webinars that we do where it's just interesting and it just makes people think differently and it connects different things that people don't think of on a day-to-day basis. So that's how we work with those sorts of fundamental behaviors.
Yeah.
Another thing that we do is we often, I worked with the London Stock Exchange to develop 3 key questions. And these are 3 key questions that people should ask when they make a decision or a judgment. You know, who have we excluded from this decision? How might
important? I'm going to repeat the questions so that it gives us all time to actually make sure we hear them. Who have we excluded from this decision?
Have we considered the lived who this will impact and the lived experience of everybody impacted?
Have we considered who this will impact and their lived experience? Mm-hmm.
Are there any gaps in our knowledge that we should include somebody else to verify our decision?
Fantastic. Are there any gaps in our knowledge that we need to include somebody else to complement what we know? Yeah.
And then what they do is then it's 3 questions. You know, this is just about habit. So we do the curiosity and judgment, and we do podcasts and we do all these different things, and people love them because it's interesting. We've just done some globally for Deloitte's, and then the 3 questions are the prompts. Then,
yeah,
you know, it's the prompts. Put them on your meeting notes. Put them on your meeting agendas. The 3 questions. Put them up in meeting rooms. Put them into every single development program that you do. You know, have them on your website. They're a very good indicator of a truly inclusive organization.
Super. So if anyone wants to capture those in the chat, that would be great. Those 3 questions, let's just recap them. Who may we have excluded with this decision? Have we considered the lived experience or the impact on the lived experience of everyone? And are there gaps in our knowledge for which we need somebody else? So super. Great. Let's think about because those are really helpful questions at the individual level, and I think operate also at a team level, because we can hold each other accountable. And I can be talking, and then you can say, "Hey, Heather, have you remembered? Have we excluded someone, or do we have some gaps in this?" So it's a great way to interact, I can imagine, as a team. In terms of a culture, one of the things I love about the book is you talk about a belonging audit. Mm-hmm. Tell us something about that and how that makes a difference to a culture in an organization.
So there's 2 things really about this that I think make it very different and effective. The first is the types of questions that are asked and what that signposts for people in the organization. And the other thing is the richness of the data that you get out of these surveys to understand lived experience. And when you really understand lived experience, you know exactly, you can cut the data in so many ways, you know which areas to target, you know exactly what behaviors to target, you know what processes need to be put in. And it's a human, the strategies that are developed for our clients then is a very human one. It will change people's behaviors and their experiences. Engagement surveys, I like to go on webinars about engagement surveys so I can challenge people on them, because
We like a challenge.
oh, I do it. Everybody's entitled to my opinion, is what. But
And nobody has a monopoly on the truth of their opinions. That's also important when it comes to belonging, right?
completely. That's one of the things about lived experience.
So let's talk about this, because you use that term a lot. And as a phenomenological researcher, that's what I look at as well, as the lived experience. So let's make that really understandable. What does that really mean?
It means how an individual mentally experiences a context. One of the things I often say to people is, the world doesn't exist beyond your perception of it. It's all Absolutely. In here. Everything is in here.
Yeah.
And lived experience is what's happening in there to people.
Yeah.
And
it's the sense we're making of our experience of being in the world. Our experience of being in the world is pretty unique, and it's made up of how we think and how we interact and how we are met actually by others in the world. Do they confirm a sense of self and belonging and welcome, or do they deny that? Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So the problem with engagement surveys as they are now is that when you speak to people who do questionnaires and surveys, they sort of spout some of the pseudoscience around how you pose a question. And one of the things that, and I as an academic, I did go off and research this to make sure that, my instinct was right. That they say that you should always ask a question in a positive or neutral way. Because if you ask it in a negative way, people are more likely to respond with a negative answer. That doesn't make sense, does it?
Well, there's a lot of research on the way we ask questions. It's a subject very close to my heart, as many of you on the call will know, having worked in the world of clean language questions. And so I think one of the things I really agree with you on is this idea of trying to take the assumptions out of the questions. Because otherwise, if we're asking questions with our own assumptions embedded in them, then we're just getting that metaphor of an echo chamber. I ask a question to actually get the response I'm looking for. And of course, the more power you have in an organization, the more able you are to make that happen. And it's not intentional, it's unconscious. And it's also a way of being managing our safety in organizations. So fully align with you in terms of the way we're asking questions makes a massive difference.
But we have to think about, with an engagement survey or an inclusion survey, we have to think about what we're asking people in terms of what do we want to know. Now, what we want to know is, what's the lived experience of those people who feel that they don't belong? Now, when you feel that you don't belong, or you feel that you're very different, it's a lonely place. And that's why you don't speak up, because you assume that it's only happening to you, that you're weird, that you're different, you're not like anybody else. You're experiencing this workplace in a way that's unique to you, very unique to you. And this is a personal experience that's similar to this in terms of I was diagnosed with ADHD at 40.
Right.
And that had this profound effect on me of, oh my God, it's not just me. Other people have this as well. Oh, no, I see. So when we're asking a survey, an engagement survey, if we're just asking positive questions, people will assume that's the experience of most people. So sometimes we have to give people permission to tell us about their negative experiences. So a question such as, is there any point in the last 6 months which you feel you have been excluded in something that is detrimental to your work? Is there any point you have been disrespected by leadership? Now, people, you might get lots of negative things. You might get the people who are your general moaners who put as much things in there as they want, but you will get some brilliant information about who's suffering.
Yes.
And you correlate performance data.
And this comes back to what we were talking about earlier, this dichotomy, and that's my word, between judgment and curiosity. So if we want to stay safe, then we're not going to go to love it you under the general moaners, because we just think, oh good lord, we don't need to hear from those people. I'm doing the best I can as a leader. But actually, if we see this as just as data about where there are areas for improvement for all of us in an organization, it's a great building block for creating more inclusive culture and sense of belonging in an organization.
It's the stories as well. There was a very beautiful moment in I did some work with the board at a big bank, and there was, I mean, we do this quite a lot actually, and what we did was we had some voiceover, we had some actors to tell stories of exclusion in workplaces, and we darken the room when we do it, turn all the lights out. And tell people phones, pens down, and people just listen. And then we turn the lights back on. You say, "What do you think?" And people, will start to talk about it, exchange. And then I'll say, "What about your organisation? Do people have experiences?" And they'll say, "No, we tend to be better."
So we're a bit better than that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then I'll say to them, these are a cross-section of your people who have told us this information. This is on your watch.
Yeah.
This is how people are feeling. This beautiful moment, this particular bank, was when somebody said, surely this is the minority. I mean, it's not. And there was one guy who was Black in the room, and he stood up and said, I can't believe you think that my experience is the same as yours. Let me tell you what my journey is like from the train into this office, why it's different to yours. And it completely changed everybody in the room, because it's close, it's real, it's happening there.
And you feel the emotion as well, don't you, when somebody shares that real experience. I think one of the things you and I both have in common is we have multi-racial marriages, and therefore our children both have mixed race. And as a mother, seeing what they live in terms of their experience, and actually how shocking it is to realize I don't have this experience of my child's life, and yet my assumption is I should somehow, because we're the same family. And yet when it comes up close like that, you realize just how little you really know of other people's experience. And when we're one step moved at work, of course, it's even more at arm's length, which is why I'm seeing in the chat lots of positive comments about starting with the behaviors, starting with how we're thinking, because that makes a really huge difference in terms of belonging.
So there's a book by Akala, and I'd recommend it to everyone. My son, who's 21, recommended that I read this after me witnessing a racist experience. And he got me to read it because Akala was brought up by a white mother, and had a Black father that he didn't know. And I brought my son up. I was divorced very early on in his life, and I brought my son up, just assuming that his experience was going to be like mine, because I was his mum and I was teaching him about the world. And Akala sums it up brilliantly in that what we have to do, you can never walk in somebody else's shoes, never, because you can't be them. But what you can do is listen to their story, and more than that, believe them. And when you listen to that story, what you do is connect to the universal human emotion. You don't have to have had the experience. It's like if you talk to somebody about miscarriage, for example, you might not have experienced that, but you know how sadness and loss feels. So that's what you connect to. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think leadership needs to be better at, in connecting to the individual and their identity.
Yeah. Beautifully said. I mean, I don't know about those of you here on the call, but even watching that 75 seconds of that short video about community earlier, it brought emotion up in me, because I could see some of you on the call, Annette, with the swimmers and people who are who I can see in my life and bits of myself, and it just brings that emotion. And that is, there was a lovely comment earlier. The questions help with the empathy. The questions and the curiosity help with the empathy, which is what we're talking about. And I think there's a request. Maybe you can pop in the chat the name of the book, Helen, at a certain moment. That would be super. So whilst I ask Helen to do that. Are there other questions, other comments from you who are listening to us? Because we've got about 9 minutes left together, and I'd love to make sure there's a great question from Winnie. Love the thinking, but how do you institutionalize this? Great question. And this comes back to this point of how do we institutionalize this sense of everyone included at work?
Sorry, yes, I was just getting the. So it's a different approach to a lot of culture change programs and leadership programs and strategy, really, because it does start with attitude. It starts with behaviors, very simple behaviors that will, in themselves, start to create better decision making, along with the questions and the curiosity, better decision making, and more inclusion. And then the processes that are developed then, if everybody's aligned, the processes will naturally be more inclusive if you've got the right attitude.
Yeah.
So
I think there's one other thing in terms of Winnie's question, because I think it's a super important question. How do we institutionalize this? Because there's so much chat saying, this is great in terms of the lived experience and the sense of curiosity and questions and identity. And, this is great news. This is music to our ears. And I think one of the things that you talk about in the book is about doing this belonging audit. So if you think about it, it's like really trying to find out where people feel a sense of belonging and perhaps why and how, and where maybe they're not. And so this is coming back to what we were talking about earlier, those questions that are particularly key to finding out or going against a phrase that you use, toxic positivity. So perhaps you could say something about that.
So yes, I this is my latest book about is resilience. It's the thing of the moment we talk about in leadership and teaching people resilience and doing resilience courses. And it's just one example of the things that we do that negate somebody's lived experience. We negate people's stories and their lived experience. When we say, you just need more resilience. No, they don't just need more resilience. People don't choose to not have resilience. People might have low resilience because of things that they have experienced in their past. They might have low experience because they low resilience because of mental health issues, of neurodevelopmental issues. They can have support when they're in distress, but you can't say to somebody, you just need to learn how to be resilient.
No.
And this happens quite a lot in the workplace with our language. So I'm often asked about inclusive language, and I don't worry about inclusive language. I often say, don't worry about inclusive language. Worry about the words that are used in organizations that deny people's human experience. So if you say to somebody, you're being too emotional, they're not being too emotional. They're being emotional because that's who they are, and that's how they're experiencing the world. So it might look different to you, but it's a fact. You're being dramatic. It's not. It feels dramatic to that person. That's how they. You're catastrophizing. You're taking this personally. That's my favorite one.
Yes, me too. Yeah, of course I am, because I'm a human being, and this is my personal experience.
And if this is what if you think, when people have said it to me, I've always gone back with, no, I'm not taking it personally. You are delivering it personally. So don't look to me. This is not how I receive something. How I receive it is up to me. But if you're not getting the response that you want, then it's how you've delivered it.
Yeah. And words are very powerful. We know that words make our world. So absolutely crucial that one of the things that we can do it sounds, again, simple, like being more curious rather than judgmental, is to be much more careful with the words we use and the tone that we deliver them in. So often called microaggressions or microexpressions. There's a lot of really excellent work out there about that. But these are the little tiny things that we do as individuals that either say to somebody, welcome, please welcome, please come and join us, or we give that unconscious message, perhaps not today. And I think that relates to, I don't know if you see on the chat the message from Yolanda. Have you had questions from organizations who feel they only have 9 to 5 to deliver on profits, their business, and then the time required to focus deeply on people in the workplace? So how do you manage that? And I think part of how I see that, Helen, and maybe you have a similar take, is it really takes a nanosecond to help someone feel welcome. And it takes a nanosecond to exclude them. And that choice is in our hands, really. Yeah.
And I think that, that sort of, even if it's only 5%, it's very simple. And it's just that the principles have got to be right. So the principles of curiosity and judgment. And for leaders, identity-centered leadership. So a program of identity-centered leadership, which makes the leader understand their own identity, first of all, and then how they connect to other people to be able to understand them and get the best out of them and support them. It's similar to servant leadership. It's about facilitation. You're a facilitator, a leader, you're a facilitator of talent and connection in teams. So these are very, very simple principles, I think.
Yeah. And sometimes the simplest things are the hardest to actually implement in life. Now, I would love to keep talking with you and these wonderful people we have from around the world, but we are coming towards the top of the hour. And one of the things that we both have a strong passion about is to say, is there one thing you can think about and do differently? Is there a nudge that you can take from this webinar? And we'd love to give you can you let us know what resonates from this conversation and how can you think or act differently? If you could pop that in the chat, that does 2 things. One, it really helps you to stimulate your thinking, because it's a question, and questions, as we know, stimulate our thinking. And I think you and I share a passion around thinking differently means we might then do differently. So if you could do that and just pop in the chat, everybody who's online, what resonates with you? What's something that might you might think differently about? And then in conclusion, I'm going to ask, maybe just give a moment or so for people to do that. And then I'm going to ask Helen, do you have a question, a favorite question that really enhances belonging?
I do. And it was something that was taught to me very early on in my career as a leader. And so I know it works. I know it makes a difference. It builds trust. It creates a sense of belonging, and it shows that you're interested in the whole person when you interact with people in your teams. And that question is simply this: how can I make your life better? So if you have to, shorten your one-to-ones to 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever it might be, you will get more richness in that 15 minutes by asking that question than having a nice long agenda for an hour and a half. So it gives permission for people to share their lived experience, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, because it invites people to talk about what's not going well, and it's framed in such a positive way. How can I? So it's personal responsibility. How can I make your life better? So it's really, really the connection, the relationship, and then you're asking what you can do to lift somebody up. So yeah, fantastic.
I think also that it's how can I make your life better acknowledges that the experience that we have in work extends way beyond work. So it impacts so much more in our life than just that time that we spend there. So I think it's a good subtle way of showing that you acknowledge that that's important.
Yeah, fully agree. And I love these comments. I don't know if you're seeing them, Helen, in the chat. Patricia, lovely to see you here. How do I want to be remembered when I'm no longer here? I mean, did you leave we all leave a footprint. Do we leave a footprint of kindness and welcome, or do we leave something quite different? And then Yolanda, perhaps going from the very individual comments to a much more organizational, this reminder to you and us, we need to be patient. about the resistance that comes to thinking about this as perhaps too soft, or that it's already ticked, or it's a box. But yeah, really, really lovely concluding comments. I would love to say thank you for all of you for being here. Thank you so much for sharing your lunch break, your morning, your evening with us. This is a super interesting conversation. I do invite you to connect with Helen May online in LinkedIn. Her business is Belonging at Work. I encourage you to take a look at the book. And I encourage you to connect also with me on LinkedIn, Heather Cairnsley at IMD. And both organizations have all sorts of resources, as you know, around inclusion, belonging, and so that we can move towards workplaces, societies, communities in which everyone is included. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Heather. That was lovely.
It was great. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you all.